and reports are that a number of students are stranded because the National Student Financial Aid Scheme has not paid their bursaries. This is despite NSFAS making an upfront payment of 2.8 billion rand to universities and 580 million rand to TVET colleges to cover student accommodation and book allowances for a month. Spokesperson at the South African Union of Students, Asive Dlanjwa, joins us on Teams now. Good morning to you, Asive, and thank you so much for your time. So we've seen a number of protests in the Eastern Cape mainly, where students are complaining that they still have not received any form of funding. We also see some universities opening their academic year, last week, with some universities and some institutions saying that they've registered first-year students who are on the NSFAS about 80% of the way. Just talk to us about, the latest. Have all the students received their funding, and what happens, to those who have not yet received payment, do you think?
Good morning to your viewers and also to your listeners. The majority of students, as we speak, will not have received their funding. Indeed, the department had allocated about 4.2 billion rand to be allocated to institutions to be able to bridge the gap between the beginning of the academic year and the time in which NSFAS would be ready to begin their processes of their normal disbursements. But what was regrettable is that there was no a plan or system from the department to be able to ensure that universities would be able to access the fund and they would be able to use and disperse this fund. Unfortunately, the majority of students, in fact, I'm tempting to say all students, because I am not aware of students that have been able to receive any sort of assistance from that upfront payment by the department, would not have been able to receive those allowances. There was no system of paying those allowances to them, particularly living allowances or transport allowances or anything that they would have needed to begin the academic year. For the students that applied this year, who have since received funding, they've also not been able to receive the allowances. And there are also students who have been funded as per NSFAS and their records, but when they get to the institutions of higher learning, institutions are saying they are not able to verify if indeed the students have been funded, and therefore the students have been left in the lurch. So it has been a rather frustrating and a very difficult time for the students, NSFAS students.
Where do you think the disconnect is, particularly between the Department of Higher Education as well as these institutions and NSFAS? I mean, like you rightfully said, there's been more cash injection. Over 53 billion rands, we know, was awarded to NSFAS in the 2024-2025 budget. I mean, just from the way you are speaking, it doesn't seem like it will cover all needs of the students. So where do you think that, the disconnect is in terms of these key stakeholders?
Look, I think the first one, we must welcome the increase in the NSFAS budget from 47 billion to 53. It heeded our cries after government had threatened to cut the funding by 13 billion rand. So we welcome this increase, number one. Number two, there's not necessarily a shortage of funding currently in the sector as we speak. There is an insufficiency of systems, there is corruption, there's incompetence and magnificence. Currently, a 53 billion rand budget is enough and should be enough to cover all NSFAS beneficiaries, the same way that the 47 billion rand last year had actually been enough to cover all the beneficiaries. It is just a pity that you had administration at NSFAS was not able to administer the funding effectively to ensure that all students were getting their allowances and on time. That is the same crisis we are having now. That because in the history of NSFAS, this is probably, if I'm not mistaken, that's going to be corrected, the first year that NSFAS or the department had advanced an upfront payment before even the commencement of registration. But that money did not assist the students because, once again, there were no systems in place to be able to use that money and ensure that the students are receiving those allowances and on time. So the crisis we are having with the funding, with our current funding model, it is that it is headed by lumpens without the slightest level of capacity to be able to administer the funding. Fortunately for us, it is not the insufficiency of funding. but that of systems and competence to be able to ensure that the rollout of this fund is done effectively and efficiently.
And of course, we will be talking to NSFAS in a moment, straight after this interview. And some of, the utterances that you're making now, some of these are under investigation. Of course, we saw the board chair of NSFAS, taking leave of absence. There are several investigations that are currently being conducted. So whilst that is going on, and we know, of course, that there are these challenges with students, and as you rightfully said, this is very frustrating to students. What's happening now at the moment, particularly with those students that are finding themselves with no accommodation? Some of them travel 500 kilometers to various institutions from their homes and are sleeping, we understand, in makeshift rooms, in libraries. How are they doing?
It's a crisis. And the gross human rights violations at its height, we must ask NSFAS, for they are aware of this. We have students that are sleeping in hallways, that are sleeping in libraries, that are sleeping in community halls, that are sleeping in political constituents' offices, that are sleeping at stations, etc. And this has been happening probably for the last 3 to 4 weeks or so. So we have a crisis, and unfortunately, and we have sought to get some answers. For instance, and there does not seem to be a clarity in terms of how are we going to deal with some of these issues. For instance, one of the things I can tell you now, once again, lest I be accused of being a prophet, is that when the end of this month comes, when all students are due, which is the deadline, when all students are due to receive their allowances, I can assure you that majority of students across the country will not receive their allowances. We are going to protest across the entire country. I can assure you that students will only probably start receiving their allowances in mid-March, which they were supposed to receive at the end of February. We say these things based on our projections and what we are seeing that there are no plans. So one of the things that, for instance, NSFAS has to take the country into confidence, even in your interview with them, is what is their plan to ensure that students get their allowances on time? All we want is their plan and their system, number one. Number two, what guarantees can they give the country that the students are going to receive the allowances on time? If they can answer those things will give us confidence, because of all the things that cause serious instability in our institutions, one is the inability to pay allowances on time. And we understand that it will be further exacerbated by the fact that in an election year, and there are people who might exploit the suffering of students to cause instability and chaos in our institutions over and above what probably should be warranted. So these are things that we are worried about. These are the things that are keeping us up at night, especially finding ourselves in the current year that we find ourselves in. So these are some of the things that we would like NSFAS to take the country into confidence about.
All right, Asive, thank you so much for your time and, of course, for coming on to the program. Of course, we're discussing all issues related to students in higher institutions of learning, particularly as it relates to NSFAS. That was Asive Dlanjwa, and he was the spokesperson from the South African Union of Students.